Welcome back to this series of the Staff College having courageous conversations about race. At a time when many of us are losing confidence in global white male leaders, do we need to consciously think about what a different form of leadership could feel like? How often do we explore the cultural norms which inform leadership behavior? How has the white world lost the concept, or did they ever have it, about the leader as a citizen, the leader as ancestor, the leader as a guardian for the future? I'm Malik, and this is episode 2, Leadership Paradigms. We will be exploring these and other questions today. With me are 3 courageous women, all of whom are involved in working with leaders in the UK and in other countries. Rosemary Campbell-Stephens MBE, who has coined the term global majority, which we explain and discuss in our first episode titled The Language We Use Matters. Kathryn Perera, Director of NHS Horizons, and Jo Davidson, Principal of the Staff College. My 3 guests have agreed to take a deep breath and bravely talk about race, culture, and leadership constructs. We are bound to get some things wrong, and at times it might be clumsy or awkward. But these women have agreed to come together in what I hope is a safe space to have an open, honest, and courageous conversation. We want to share this with listeners in the hope that it spurs you to have courageous conversations with your friends and colleagues. Because unless we're prepared to take that risk, we can't shift anything. Rosemary, in our last episode, you explained the term global majority. Can you give us a quick recap of what that means?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So the term global majority is a collective term that first and foremost speaks to and encourages those so-called to think of themselves as belonging to the majority. So when I'm asked to define what I mean by that, global majority refers to people who are Black, Asian, Brown, dual heritage, Indigenous to the Global South, and or have been racialized as ethnic minorities. And when you look at those groups of people, we're actually talking about approximately 80% of the world's population, making them the global majority.
Thank you, Rosemary. Kathryn and Jo, this term has really got both of you thinking, me too, actually. But has this prompted an interest in exploring what global leadership looks and feels like? Kathryn?
Yeah, so Sherry, one of the reasons that I first came into conversation with Rosemary and asked Jo to introduce us, and we started to develop a friendship and a conversation, was because I was facilitating a session for directors of children's services and others that was about inner complexities, developmental ideas, how we know the world. And Rosemary, in her eloquent and gentle way, in the contributions that she made in that session, I took her to be pointing out to me that my references were almost exclusively white. And yet the heuristics that I was using, the rules of thumb, the ancient wisdoms, many of them related back to communities of color. Rosemary, I think that you referenced a number of writers, African-American and African, who had developed the underpinning ideas that I was referencing in the session. And yet the session, in terms of the expertise that we were leaning into, was predominantly white, predominantly Harvard, kind of East Coast, United States, in fact. And one of the things it prompted me to think about was, and this is my term, so it may or may not be perfect, but unconscious appropriation of ideas, by which I mean the process over time, over decades, hundreds of years and more, of appropriating knowledge and then codifying it in a way that is acceptable to Western, white-dominated institutions and presenting that with more credence. And as a woman, I've experienced versions of that, where I have known and experienced knowledge in different forums with women, but that when it is presented through quasi-scientific or social scientific channels, it's considered credible. And so it was that really got me thinking in my own work, how do we audit whom we are referring to, the reach that we have to really tens of thousands of people that we get to speak to through our courses and our online programs? From where are we deriving that knowledge, and why are we referencing it in the way that we do? And I think that's something that all leaders who have any form of voice and platform in a formal sense can do. Just check back and audit. From where are you deriving your ideas, and to whom do you choose to reference them? That was one of my big pieces of learning.
Yeah. And Jo, what about you?
Yeah, so having been in the same session as Kathryn, hosting it, the conversation there and then the conversation that ensued between the three of us really got me thinking about the staff college offer and the sort of leadership paradigm, leadership thinking it relies on. Now, we pride ourselves very much on the diversity of thinking, diversity of thought that we bring into our programs. But like Kathryn, when I started thinking about it and looking at it, there were two things that particularly struck me. The first was that whilst we were looking at different models of leadership, for example, things like Ubuntu, we were keeping that firmly in the Black and Asian leadership space. So we weren't even threading it through any of our other programs, which is quite shameful. But yeah, that is what we were doing, and we could have a whole separate conversation about why that might be. And then the second issue for us as well, and I think it sort of chimes with what Kathryn was just saying there about sort of scientific basis, is that when we looked or have begun to look at the curriculum offer that we've got, if there's anything that's sort of scientific-y and businessy, it is white and almost predominantly male. But when we get into the more the leadership, the being of the leader, the more sort of spiritual aspects, interestingly, we are drawing thinking and quotes very often from Black and global majority thinkers. And I think that's really intriguing about the sort of head and the heart element, and why it is we've done that. Have we just fallen into that by accident, or is it because it's just easier, because the sort of Western form of leadership thinking is just more easily accessible to us, or was more easily accessible to us? I think no, I don't think we can say these days sort of global reach and global information. We could argue that anymore. And that coincided as well. The timing of this coincided with me reading a book called Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is a Native American, which was chiming incredibly with me as well about human place in the world and human place in nature, and the human ability to believe that it conquers nature when actually the natural world is older and more sophisticated than anything we humans could think about, and some of the teachings and wisdom of Native American communities was coming through that as well. So it's absolutely. I think we owe it as a college, but I think any leader owes it to think about, well, what are the leadership paradigms that I'm using? What are the leadership models? Where do they come from? Who is it I'm listening to? I did a quick audit of my book case on my leadership books And absolutely that confirmed what I was thinking, a very white and almost predominantly male set of concepts there. Yeah. And I thought we were doing well.
That's fascinating, actually, that you're talking about kind of, the data stuff and the hard stuff and the evidence-based stuff is all almost exclusively white and male. But then when you think about intuition and, sort of age-old wisdom, it's been parked in a different room almost.
Yeah.
And that is fascinating, actually. And I think, it makes us all stop and think about how, what is our responsibility as people who are in contact with hundreds of senior leaders across the spectrum, about how we shape the discourse with people. And I just wanted to really ask Rosemary here about her view on leadership and ancestorhood, as she sometimes talks about it. And just, can you tell us a little bit more about your thinking around that, Rosemary?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely, Sherry. So to go back to 2003 and getting the invitation to develop a leadership program for Black and Asian educators, I flipped that invitation to not just get more Black and Asian educators into leadership positions, but to actually look at a different leadership model. And so I began to look at leadership models that actually came from global majority cultures. And so for me, it was really, really key and really important to be reading other stuff, to be looking at other academies. And lots of African American and African writers have been writing about leadership from a global majority perspective. So that was key. And one of the things that I found within that was the importance of the notion and concept of ancestorhood. So for me, ancestorhood is definitely about the fact that we are on a continuum. From the African perspective, we as human beings are on a continuum. And what that means is we are connected to the ancestors who have gone, and we are connected to our own ancestorhood through what we do now. So it's like playing forward into the future. What we're doing now plays into that whole thing about being a good ancestor to come. So ancestorhood is really key because it ties us to notions of how we as individuals and how we as human beings are holistic human beings, not just focusing intellectually, but also on a number of different levels, including spiritually. And that's one of the ways that ancestorhood plays into the way of thinking. And the other thing is that as ancestors, we very clearly understand that we are custodians of this planet. So it goes back to Jo's point about laws of nature and the fact that we are custodians of the planet. We are part of something that is much bigger than ourselves. And so in order for us to be good ancestors and to be good custodians, we need to tap into that indigenous knowledge about what it is to be human, what it is to play our part in the universe, and therefore look after and respect the planet, nature, each other as human beings, and respect our role as ancestors to come.
Right. That does give us a huge amount of food for thought. Kathryn, what do you think that in the work that you're doing amongst the leaders that you're working with, there is a kind of a readiness to explore what Rosemary's just been talking about? Do you think if you put it out there that people would just look at you and say, what are you talking about? Or this isn't the management course I came to be on. What do you think?
One of the things that I've observed, Sherry, in public service, so I'm 4.5 years into the NHS, and before that I worked in a very different environment. I worked in politics and campaigning. And one of the things I've observed in public service is the dominant focus on physical energy, intellectual energy. So what we need to do, how we get it done. And it's critical, of course it is, for service delivery, service improvement, but it has severe limitations within the context of the conversation that we're having today. It has limitations in what it opens up as possibilities for conversations. And it means that I think when we are designing courses, thinking about the designs for programs, like all human beings, what we do is we reach around for the ideas that are to hand. You know, Milton Friedman said this about a crisis. He said that the job of anybody who wants to shift culture is to have a real or imagined crisis and to develop the ideas that you can pick up, right? Because they're lying around. So I think the tendency is towards that. And that means that the existing paradigms of what expertise is, of which voices derive from what sources, are where we tend to lean. And it's one of the things that makes me enjoy work with the Staff College, because of course that work is predominantly about taking a step back, stepping into spaces where we will equally value social and spiritual and emotional energy, and also acknowledging that that's countercultural work. When I came into this role, one of the things the team that I'm part of did was to run the School for Change Agents, which is a massive open online community. More than 100,000 NHS staff have taken part in the school. And last year, I commissioned an audit of our resources. And to my naive shock, as somebody who had participated in designing and presenting that course, 97% of the references to experts were to white experts. More than 70% were to male experts. And indeed, in that 3% that were people of color, most of the references were to Barack Obama or Martin Luther King. And that's even within a group of people who believe themselves to be and try to be inclusive, or have that as part of the narrative of what we believe we are trying to do in the world. So when you ask me, what does that mean for most people who are in senior leadership roles, for whom these conversations may be new, may be uncomfortable, we have a long way to go. We being an inclusive we have a long way to go.
Yeah. Jo, can I bring you into that conversation? What do you think about what Rosemary said about ancestorhood and how that feels like for the work that you do, and whether that's something, is going to be tough for you to push forward in the work that you're doing across the Staff College?
I think there's something about the times that we're living in at the moment that I think the idea and the concepts of leaders being citizens themselves and being citizens of the world, and therefore having a responsibility to the people that have come before them, but to the people that are still to come and are going to be their ancestors. I think there's something currently that taps into the zeitgeist a bit, or better than it might have done a number of years ago. And I certainly think within the local government sector, in fact, any public sector, the whole issue about the sort of business focus and short-termism, I think people have found for some time now very difficult as a concept, as the guiding concept for the work that they do. So I think, just the timing of this means that a deeper exploration and use of ancestorhood and those types of leadership thinking it is going to be on sort of pretty fertile ground. But I think more than that, I think when we look round at really brilliant leaders, and I don't mean sort of global leaders, I mean leaders in communities and leaders of place, leaders in public sector, leaders in private sector, there's quite a significant number of them that, whilst they might not call the work and the thinking they do connected to ancestorhood, nonetheless, they have got a worldview and a way of leading, which is about the collective, which is about the long term, which is about leaving things in a better place than where they were before. And they're not put off or wrong-footed by some of the more immediate short-term issues, and they build a community around them that can take on the development and thinking and the change, and they engage others in that work, and they seek a true diversity of community, true diversity of leaders and people that are making change. So I think there's more connectivity in the work of really great leadership than we think. What we haven't done, because of our obsession with the types of models that we focused on, is not made the connection with other ways of thinking. And I think that's where colleagues like Rosemary are so essential to this work, because they bring in other ways of thinking to us.
Yeah. And I'm just going to ask Rosemary this question, really. What does this discussion then mean? I mean, I think both Jo and Kathryn have talked about the lack of diversity in the work that they are doing, in the constructs that they put forward. They're very much kind of data-driven, white male leadership constructs, if you like, and less around the Black and global majority constructs of ancestral leadership. So just asking Rosemary, really, what does this discussion then mean for our listeners? And what can they practically do to start to shift the dial? What do we need in the discourse to help them to have this discourse, really, to shift the dial?
Well, I think, Sherry, that one of the key things that is really clear from what both Jo and Kathryn have said is that this is a conversation whose time has come. Mm. So part of the work has already been done, in that there is a realization that the current models no longer serve us well. So the rethinking and the searching for ways of being and ways of seeing that work in the interest of the greater good are things that leaders are looking for. So that's the first thing. We need to be encouraged that there will be a receptive sort of ground for sowing these seeds. And then the other thing that I think is really key that Jo said, and it's around the language that we use, is that if we begin to say, well, okay, if the current systems aren't working, what is it that we want to fix? And where are we going to look for the answers? Then what we're trying to develop in people is a world view, a global view. And if we look at, for example, some of the women leaders that have managed the COVID-19 storm well, then they are women leaders who have sought to work in partnership, who have sought to work as a collective, who have valued different perspectives and different viewpoints. So right within this time that we are living in and working through, there is a direction of travel in terms of progressive thinking that says that let's look at different ways of leading and being and seeing.
Mm.
And so then people are easily guided to global majority type mindsets, because actually, intuitively, it sits within them anyway. It's part of what it is to be human. The African-centered concepts that I think about in terms of Ubuntu are absolutely at the core of what it is to be a human being. And so it taps into that primal self in everybody, irrespective of their ethnic background or their cultural background. It just ties in and resonates with what it is to be a human being. Yeah. And so for me, I'm very encouraged that we can begin to have these conversations. But we have to get through the birth pains of initially getting people to engage. And that's why it's been so interesting and so helpful to hear Kathryn and Jo be really honest about how, when they initially hear that term, how they felt emotionally, really, not intellectually, how they felt emotionally. And therefore, for us then, in terms of encouraging people to have that conversation, to encourage them to go through that birthing canal of accepting that there's the initial kind of violence in terms of attacking everything that we think we know about ourselves and the world. But once we've birthed through the other side, we actually see something that we can all be a part of. Because the other thing about global majority is that it leaves it open for everybody to be a part of. It's a very inclusive term, actually.
Yeah.
And I can see us further down the road just talking about us all being global citizens, part of the global majority.
Yes.
So it started as something which was bringing for the margins, those who are outside. Oh, I can see somebody wants to come in. But yeah, I just think I'm excited by the prospect.
Yeah.
And I think that there is more fertile ground out there than we think for these conversations to flourish.
Yeah, you've evoked some amazing images there, Rosemary, about birthing. And we know, all of us, that there is joy at the end of a painful labor or birth. There is always joy. So that's a really good image to kind of end this particular podcast on. And I want to say a big thank you to my guests, Rosemary Campbell-Stephens MBE, Kathryn Perera and Jo Davidson, for their honesty and openness in discussing some really difficult topics, particularly about how you take forward concepts that are alien to our audiences, and how you challenge their perspectives about race and culture. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please do share it with friends and colleagues, and tune in to our third and final episode, The Harvard Way or the Global Leadership Way.